welcome Assistant Commissioner Basu to our evidence session today on counter-terror and counter-extremism. We are very grateful for your time this afternoon. Could I just ask you just a sort of opening remarks on your assessment at the moment of the terror threat and also the work that is being done in order to counter it?
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to give you some context for this session. I probably wanted to start by acknowledging the Chief Coroner's findings in respect of the Westminster attack. That particular atrocity, along with Manchester, Finsbury Park, Borough Market and Parsons Green, they all took place on my watch when I was Senior National Coordinator for Counter-Terrorism Policing. It's important to me, for the panel, to know that I think about the 36 who were murdered and all the victims every single day, and particularly in this job. It was incredibly painful to hear the coroner say there was a possibility that Police Constable Palmer might have been saved were it not for shortcomings in the security system at the palace, including supervision of those engaged. And we unreservedly accepted those conclusions. We have improved. We are committed to further improvements. In terms of the threat picture you asked, we learnt that those attacks were not a temporary escalation of the threat. They are a sustained shift in that threat, and the UK CT machine to this day continues to run red hot. The attacks demonstrated both the breadth of targets and methodologies employed have increased. The weapons used by attackers can now range from homemade explosives to a family car or an everyday kitchen knife. And the greatest concern to me comes from simple attacks on softer targets that are cheap to mount, easy to disguise, and therefore harder to see and stop. The overriding threat to the UK remains from those inspired by Daesh and the resurgent Al-Qaeda, but our operations reflect a much broader range of dangerous ideologies, including very disturbingly rising extreme right-wing activity. Across the counter-terrorism network at the moment, we are recording a record high of over 700 investigations. That is a combined figure of both counter-terrorism policing and MI5. Despite thinking for a long time our biggest threat was returning or directed foreign fighters, the majority of attackers here who have attacked or plotted are UK or dual UK nationals. And since the Westminster attack in March last year, we have stopped 17 attacks. That's 4 of which were extreme right-wing terrorist plots. I expect those figures to increase. Against this threat, we've significantly increased our engagement with the business community around protective security, and we've increased the number of public awareness campaigns to encourage vigilance and reporting of suspicious activity. At the same time as this step change in CT threat, we've dealt with alleged hostile state activity in Salisbury, and we also conducted the most extensive review of the UK CT machine in a decade. I believe David Anderson called it one of the most extensive ever, reporting directly to the Home Secretary. To keep ahead of the game, we need to make those changes that we identified to government in that report, which runs to over 1,200 pages. But for me, it's been like fine-tuning a Formula One car that's still going around the track setting a lap record. My predecessor, Mark, when he was in front of you a year ago today, quote, "Despite our best endeavours, we are not yet as well matched to the threat as we were a year ago." So 1 year on, I'd like to tell you that we are matched to the current threat, but the reality is we are not. We start from a position of strength. We have a national police, security service and government tripartite approach to counter-terrorism that's been honed over decades. It's still the envy of many people in the world. It is world-class. But matching that new threat, including now extreme right-wing terrorism and hostile state activity, requires new ways of working and for us to maintain our current resources. We're working very closely with the Home Office, who have been supportive. They also recognise that policing is a system with global reach but local connectivity. I depend entirely on well-resourced local police forces, from neighbourhood policing through to crisis response. It is extremely difficult for CT policing when we are constantly working to short-term funding arrangements, so a longer-term funding settlement would greatly assist. And lastly, it is my view the government's most important pillar of contest has always and will always be prevent, and we all need to talk much more about it. Thanks for letting me speak.
Thank you very much. Appreciate those remarks. Can I just ask you a little further about some of those points? You talked about 700 investigations, and what's your assessment then of the main cause of why the number of investigations has increased?
About 80% of those investigations will continue to be Islamist jihadist threat. 20% or so will be other, including a significant number of right-wing ideological threat. So there is no doubt whatsoever in my mind that the two ideologies, both perverse, are both feeding each other. So there is no doubt whatsoever that post the terrorist attacks of last year, some proxy measures for that increase in threat would be an increase in hate crime, particularly religious aggravated hate crime. We've seen a significant rise in that, and the recent figures that were released demonstrate that. That is not just about reporting, that is about increased offending. So there's a tolerance issue. And I think I've said this before publicly. I think when the Westminster attack happened, I think people were looking at the UK as a very hostile place to do business, and that might have lowered the bar to some extremists who thought perhaps actually a simple plot could work. So I think there's no doubt that it generated in the minds of some extremists an intention or brought their capability forward, and we certainly heard a lot about that. And if you see the number of plots that we've actually disrupted, it was 13 in the previous 4 years before Westminster. It was effectively 13 in, I think, just over 8 months last year. So without a doubt, the success of one attack undoubtedly bred further attempts, certainly more chatter, and then we've got the two ideologies sort of feeding each other.
And what's your assessment of the geographic spread of the threat and the investigations and the number of police forces you have involved in this?
It remains largely consistent. So London will always be 55% or more of the threat. It also has the vast majority of the iconic sites which terrorists are looking at here in London. So this is where the greatest threat is. Our counter-terrorism units around the country are resourced on the base of where that threat is. So it's of no surprise that major urban centres, West Midlands, North West and North East, along with London, have the greatest resilience and investigative capacity within their counter-terrorism units.
Thank you. We want to cover a series of different things, these points, starting with the far-right issues, because we're looking at that as part of another inquiry as well. But before we do so, I just convey our thanks to you and to all of the officers and staff who work with you on the challenging work that you have had to do in response to these terror threats and keeping all of us safe. So thank you, for that. Raymond Chishti.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you very much for your statement, and all you and your officers do day in, day out to keep our country and our citizens safe. Thank you. On the far-right perspective, your predecessor, Sir Mark Rowley, called the threat from the far-right significant and concerning. Last year there's been a significant rise in far-right terrorist activity and an attack in London, including a plot to kill a Member of Parliament with a machete. What is the current level of threat posed by the far-right extremists to our society and our country?
Well, I agree entirely with Mark's analysis. You'd expect that. I was his deputy at the time. We effectively supplied the intelligence requirement that led to national action being prescribed by the then Home Secretary Amber Rudd. That's the first prescription since 1940, the British Union of Fascists being the last sort of extreme right-wing, effectively terrorist organisation. So the fact that we've now got both national action and two of its kind of affiliated groups, Scottish Dawn and NS131, prescribed, tells you something very dangerous about the state of society. I mentioned earlier on about hate crime being up.
Yeah.
You know, there's something for me that says, you know, there is a ever-growing threat. Now, up until the Operation Improvement Review I mentioned with David Anderson, one of the big lessons learned from that was we needed much more parity of how we looked at what was called domestic extremism over international counter-terrorism. So there was some parity of approach. Yeah. So we're beginning to do more post-prescription of national action, looking at the threat in concert with MI5 and JTAC.
Yeah.
So my prediction is that's only going to reveal that the situation is potentially worse and growing. And the hate crime gives me that kind of proxy indication of that. We're also seeing more prevent referrals in the extreme right-wing space. Yeah. So again, that's a proxy indication that extremism in the extreme right-wing area is increasing. And we are seeing across Europe far-right activity increasing as well. There's no doubt that crosses the border into the UK. And there have been attempts by groups here to coordinate with European partners as well. All of which we're allied to, all of which there's been some very good work with Border Force to stop some of those people coming into the country. So the short answer is, I would never want to be complacent about this. I think it's rising. It's still, as I said before, about 20% of the threat, as opposed to the vast majority of the threat still coming from Islamist jihadism. But it's growing.
Can I just ask a clarification, if I may? Last year we saw the terrorist attack with regards to the incident in Finsbury Park. When we saw the judgment in that case, the remarks by the sentencing judge, Mrs. Justice Gubb, who said that the time it took for the individual to see content online, I think it was linked to the EDL, Tommy Robinson, was mentioned in that. These are not my words, these are the words of the judge who presided in that case. And the time it took to get sucked into that poison ideology and carry out a terrorist attack was very short. And it showed the threat that is posed by individuals out there who get sucked in to some of that material and carry out that threat. What's being done to address that, and how many of those cases in that category do you have where you have real concern about individuals? Because you have intelligence on IPN and different information that you have. How much of that significant threat is there, and have the agencies following on from that judgment, along with the social media companies, taken that threat seriously?
We have taken that threat seriously. The criminal threshold, the very high bar that is set for material that's online, the extreme right-wing criminal threshold test is very small. So at the moment, I think it's less than 0.5% of the total material that we've taken down or looked at has been in that space. Again, I'm not complacent about it. That's largely because they're relatively disorganised and don't have the same kind of machine that, for instance, Daesh had. In terms of total number of investigations, we have over 100 live investigations in the domestic extremism space, the vast majority of those being extreme right-wing and far-right. The most disturbing elements of those tend to be in the lone actor space. So Finsbury Park was a very good example of that. Thomas Mayer was a very good example of that, which is people who've got other problems surrounding the most malleable, vulnerable people, as you say, being sucked very quickly into this ideology, and often having no touch points with the rest of society. So it makes it very, very difficult to spot.
Can I just ask you just a clarification on that in relation to the time it takes for that person to be sucked in to carry out a terrorist attack? We saw the horrific, tragic loss of Joe Cox, our parliamentary colleague. We saw a threat last year, an attempt to kill a member of parliament by a machete. And then, if I may give you something which I have here, on Twitter I get, you would say, I guess if it was a Pakistani Muslim, he'd be top of your list. You are a disgrace. Put that to one side. You click on the icon that comes up with that Twitter account. Muslims have no place in Christian country. Go to a Muslim country. We don't want you. Adore Obi is a Muslim extremist. It is not for me to say he should be exterminated. That will be naughty. The Mayor of London is a scum. And then we see an image on there with bomb vest around the Mayor of London and saying, Allahu Akbar, God is great at the top of it, on the same content that it goes up. If ever one saw extremist content, it's out there. The Mayor of London does a great job, in terms of aspirations. Worked hard, did the right thing. We can disagree with his politics, but he's entitled to go out there, do his job without having extremist material put against him. I'm in public office, and I never look over my shoulder. I go on the train, and these individuals, this one here says he's my constituent. I don't know what they look like. There's no image of this person, but they contact you, and then you read behind what they say. And the point I make to you is, we will go on doing our job because we're elected by the public to do our job. It's up to the intelligence services. How much of the threat from individuals like this, lone actors, when you go through tweet after tweet, which is of extremist material, parliamentary security look at it, they will look at it with our Kent police. How much of a threat do these individuals pose to the security and well-being of members of parliament doing their job day in, day out?
So it's a very difficult question to answer, so you'll find me incredibly sympathetic. I'm a public servant who gets that kind of material as well. I know it's incredibly difficult to live with day in, day out. Some of that stuff is completely reprehensible. Some of it will cross criminal thresholds. Where it crosses criminal thresholds, we will investigate and take action. Where it doesn't, and I shouldn't be in this space because I'm a law enforcement officer and I should be dealing with criminal thresholds, but we have got to challenge extremist behaviour even if it doesn't cross criminal thresholds, because the kind of intolerance that it brings, whether or not it's white supremacism, sort of the national action type of perverse ideology, or whether it's Islamist jihadist ideology, it needs to be challenged. There is a very high psychological bar for people going from words to violence, and there's I'm not an expert in this area, but there's a lot of psychologists who will talk about people living a fantasy life in the virtual world who are never ever going to take that towards the real world. We have experts who advise us as operators in terms of where people fit in that threshold and where they might, but it is a very difficult clinical professional judgment. We have very good people doing it in terms of behavioural science, but it is a very difficult judgment to make.
And can I just ask just on that, on the point you make, there are experts like Peter Newman at King's College London, and they say you get categories of individuals who are either disturbed, disillusioned, and quite clearly dangerous. You've got the three Ds there on that. And the point I make with regards to this, I'm trying to understand from you, from the investigation that you have, what does it take to flip that individual from having so much hatred to individuals based on their faith to then carrying out an attack? I'm not saying in this case it would or not, but we saw it from the judgment last year. It's like that. They get sucked in from what they see on extremist material and they go out and do it. We will do our jobs, go out there on the trains day in, day out. But from what needs to be done to help address some of that threat?
A couple of things. So in the lone actor space, unlike terrorists who work as cells or work as groups of individuals, where the prevalence of mental health, mental illness in those groups is the same as normal society, we do see a much higher incidence of mental health and mental illness problems in the lone actor space, which is the Thomas Mayers and the Darren Osborns of this world. So when you ask me what it takes to flip into that, normally it's a sense of vulnerability, a sense of personal grievance, and perhaps an underlying mental health problem or an addiction. What is disturbing, and you quite rightly point this out, is the speed at which, if you're vulnerable and you lack protective factors in your life, that you can be influenced by online material. It's why it's one of the great pillars of Prevent, is to try and get this stuff off social media, where that in itself has had probably, you did ask a question about factors. My personal view is the growth of social media in this area and being able to do this is probably the greatest single difference in terms of the ramping up the terrorist threat, regardless of the ideology. So we have to be as clinical in trying to get the hateful stuff removed from extreme right-wing as we have been from Islamists.
And can I just clarify, just two things if I may. What roles or responsibilities do other agencies or organisations have or should have in preventing far-right extremism?
Do you want to be specific?
Yes, of course. I think I've given you an example of the social media.
Yeah.
There's material on there, and some of them get sucked in by what they see online. And you've answered one point. Some of them do not read what's written. The reason I got this tweet was after I put up a picture with the Bishop of Rochester campaigning for religious freedom in Pakistan for a Christian mother who was being persecuted under blasphemy laws. And the person says to me, all I care is about Pakistani Muslims. Well, obviously he hasn't read what I put on there. So these people often do not read exactly what's being written. They want to believe what they want to believe. In relation to the social media, you're doing what you're doing in intelligence agencies to get a gap on it. But if that material is being out there and it allows people to be sucked in, so those social providers, media providers that you're working with, are they doing what they should be doing to prevent this far-right extremist material online? Yeah,
so I'm glad you've been specific about social media providers because, as I've said, that's the greatest threat. So if I'd been sitting here a year ago, and certainly, or 18 months ago prior to the first attack, I'd have probably been calling them out. The reality is they're, 2017 has been a shock and a watershed year for a lot of people, and I think that includes big tech. And it does depend where you are in the world and where you're talking to these people in the world. But I think they've recognised that it's no longer good enough to say we're platforms when we're actually publishers, and they realise they've got to do something about it. I'm not sure they were as match fit to do something about it as we all thought that they might have been. Were they putting enough resource, effort, people into this problem? Not sure they were. I think they're really stepping up. So we obviously have an ongoing relationship. The government has an ongoing relationship with them. When I say us, Counter-Terrorism, Policing and MI5, they are coming much more to the table and doing something about it. So Twitter's a great example of that. First quarter of this year took down 1.9 million pieces of violent extremist ideology. None of the big players want any kind of criminal content on their platforms. They've been very clear about that. They're trying to do more about it. My big plea to them is when you're taking stuff down, and they are now starting to use automated artificial intelligence techniques to do that, is it's okay spotting it and taking it down, but if you don't read it and you don't understand what it is and you don't understand what the underlying threat is and you don't report it to us, that's a real gap in intelligence. But the aspiration has to be for all of them and for us that the stuff doesn't get uploaded in the first place. So that's where we want AI to be.
Do they not report it to you?
They've not always done that. They're beginning to recognise that that's a gap. So we press them to take stuff down. But of course, some of their systems don't have a human eye running over them, and that's the difficulty. So unless they change their business model to do that, that would be a problem for us. So we do put pressure on them to say, report what you take down. And I think Mark reported to this committee one in which bomb-making instructions had quite rightly been spotted, flagged and taken down, but they hadn't reported it. And it took several months for that to come to us due to a post-incident investigation.
Given what you know they're supposed to be trying to do at the moment, would it shock you then if there were still national action videos available on Twitter or Facebook or YouTube?
It wouldn't shock me. I know there still are. So what keeps happening is, and this is well above my capability in terms of IT, but this is my point about trying to stop stuff being uploaded in the first place. Once it's uploaded, unless it's taken down almost instantaneously or immediately, it is very often copied, hyperlinked to somewhere else, and then reposted as soon as we've taken something down. So it isn't just the companies taking it down, it's other people then immediately reposting. So it's a bit like painting the full thread bridge. And we need better AI to enable us to do that. And the utopian, I've no idea how far this is away. You'd have to get real experts in to discuss it. But at some point, we've got to get to the position where it's taken down. Effectively, anyone trying to upload won't be able to upload because it hits lots of particular flags. But creating an algorithm for that is incredibly difficult. That's what the experts tell us.
They've got quite a lot of money, mind.
They have. So, and I say the same thing. You've definitely got the resources. You've definitely got some of the best brains in the world. What they do need, and this is something we need as well, there isn't a body of research in the same way that there is for serial murderers or paedophiles. So you're looking at creating an algorithm that tells you what terrorist behaviour is. And we need better understanding of what the behavioural triggers would be to create an algorithm for a company to be able to A, spot when somebody's re-engaging, or B, spot when stuff is going on. And I'm not talking about the very obvious, there's a lot of very obvious material that goes on that's very easy to spot and their robotics can take down. There's a lot of other stuff that doesn't quite get to that threshold. And I would like to see them taking extremism that doesn't cross criminal thresholds seriously, although I might be criticised to not be my place to say.
Well, on that line, thank you, Chair. Assistant Commissioner, I mean, I've just literally, as you're speaking, just gone on straight away onto YouTube and Twitter, as I've done in some of these sessions before, and immediately have found, Tommy Robinson for PM, pictures of members of this House, the BME community, describing them as anti-white British, and then material from the Democratic Football Lads Alliance, all promoting Tommy Robinson's speech, absolutely blatant far-right content, straight away on YouTube and Twitter. No doubt it would be on Facebook as well. And Facebook have actually admitted to me that they hold a different standard actually for abuse targeted at public figures when I complain about abuse that has been targeted towards myself. Despite what you've said, do you really think that they are getting this
so
and taking
just
action?
To be sympathetic with your point, the courts used to hold police officers to a different standard when they were assaulted on duty. I found that particularly reprehensible, but that was the case at the time. So we distinguish in policing between far right and extreme right wing. So where it crosses a criminal threshold, that's when we get involved and we start dealing with it. And of course we have to put it in front of the Crown Prosecution Service. It has to cross a high bar. And because we're right into the emotive sort of area of free speech, censorship, it becomes very, very difficult. Some of these companies, bear in mind where they're registered, bear in mind the vast majority are registered in the United States, where freedom of speech is kind of the cornerstone of that particular democracy. It becomes very difficult to have a conversation with them about thresholds and where they set their thresholds. So far-right activity is not necessarily criminal. It might be abhorrent. I grew up in the 60s, 70s and 80s in this country with the National Front, and I had a particularly hard time as a child. So I'm very sympathetic with anyone who has to face this kind of stuff day in, day out. But there are thresholds. If we took everything that was on social media as a threshold, there aren't enough taxes in the world to pay for the police force you'd need large enough to try and investigate and prosecute, which is why I think there should be some societal pressure about having a conversation about where, not criminal, but where in the non-criminal space we challenge as opposed to censor.
Well, specifically in that regard, do you think it was appropriate that Lord Pearson and Gerard Batten invited Stephen Yaxley-Lennon here to Parliament yesterday to sit and dine and promote it all over social media?
Well, that's a political judgment I'd rather not comment on.
But it's these sorts of things that are driving these debates. You concede that?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Douglas Ross.
Sure. Your predecessor told this committee last year about social media, to quote, "They do some good work with us." You said about 5 minutes ago, if I was sat here a year ago, I would have been calling them out. Who's correct?
Sorry,
so your predecessor said they do some good work with your team, and you were saying if you were in his seat last year, you would have been, to quote you, calling them out. Yeah,
and so did Mark. So we were both of the view that some good work isn't good enough, and I think the answer I gave was there's more work to do. What
you've been speaking about is work that they've done in the last year. Yeah. What was he speaking about then last year that was the good work?
Well,
because you were very clear to my colleague that you would have been calling them out. You had no caveats to that.
Well, calling them out to do more.
Okay.
So what they've done is since 2010, hopefully you're familiar with our Counter-Terrorism Internet Referral Unit. Mm-hmm. So that has engaged with 300 companies since it was founded back in 2010. 308,000 pieces of terrorist ideology removed from the internet. All of that has been done through voluntary cooperation with those 300 companies, of which the vast majority sit on the big platforms. So those big companies, what they've done, effectively they have listened to when we've flagged stuff to them and they have taken stuff down. What we needed was more than that. We needed what Twitter managed this year. We needed them, with their resources and their brains, to come up with techniques, which means they could take stuff down en masse. I'd rather my CTIU wasn't ploughing through the internet every day looking for pieces of terrorist material. I'd rather they were investigating.
Have they worked well enough together to meet the needs of your team?
No, that would have been another good thing to call them out on a year ago. But now I think this is not a matter for policing. I think the government have got them together to start discussing how they can be more formidable as a force and share technologies. Particularly,
but they're not doing that yet.
Yeah, I think they are.
As well as they could. You don't think there's a problem?
My experts would tell me that they are stepping up, and certainly my conversations with them, they have been much more positive than ever that they need to step up in this space.
Sorry, I'm not following you.
I just want
to be clear for our evidence. Are they doing enough, or do they need to step up? Because you said both, and I just can't quite follow which one you mean.
Well, a year ago I would have told them to step up.
Particularly on sharing information and sharing algorithms, etc. Are they doing enough between these different companies who are competitors to share any good algorithms, etc., to take down similar material? Or are they still acting in silos? Therefore, you could maybe get it off Facebook but not Twitter, etc.
I don't think they're acting in silos anymore, but that is new behaviour post-2017. So that's where they've stepped up. Whether or not that is a continual, iterative, accelerated process or not, I don't know. I can't answer that question. But we will maintain, what I want to do is maintain good relationships with them, because we can't do this by ourselves. We can't do this necessarily by legislation, because it depends where they are in the world, but that's a matter for government. What we do need to do is through cooperation, and actually calling them out continually in public, I'm not sure is the best way to get that cooperation long term. I think they are sitting in rooms together wondering about how they can do this, and I'm not for 1 second saying that's because they've all of a sudden developed this huge social conscience. There will be a obvious corporate responsibility to the people who fund them to make sure that they're not damaging their reputations by hosting this stuff. They're not stupid. I think they get that entirely, that corporate reputations stand or fall on this. And 2017 was a huge wake-up call for them in that regard.
You've touched on it already, the digital hash, where things come down automatically, so they never actually appear online and potentially haven't been seen by a human eye. How big is that problem? Can you quantify it? Because obviously you haven't seen them. So you've given one example where you had an investigation and you ultimately went back to a post that had automatically been removed with bomb-making instructions. But do you have an estimate of what percentage of these ones that come down automatically really should be referred to you that aren't?
No, I'm sorry, I couldn't.
So how can you say it's a problem?
Because we've got specific examples of where it's happened.
But how big a problem is it?
I can't give you a percentage on that. I can
But
go back
surely,
to my experts and ask.
Okay, well, I think we need that because if we are to encourage these companies to share this information with you, I know you're doing that as well, we need to know how big a problem it is, because I would assume it's quite a big problem. And how do you balance up the issue between making sure this content doesn't appear online and people don't see it, but actually ensuring some people do see it, so it's reported and the perpetrators are brought to justice?
Yeah,
because
so
again, your
really
predecessor has mentioned how actually the internet's going darker, so it's actually hampering your efforts, yet there's a public safety element to it as well.
So I think that last part's really important. So there is a displacement effect, obviously, by getting rid of it in the first place, whereby we are less likely to see the threat, less likely to see the person that we can actually go and arrest and interdict. But actually the scale of the problem is so large that I would rather, on balance, make sure that there was as little out there as possible. The other thing is that deflection tends to happen on, it tends to deflect to much smaller platforms with much narrower reach. And now that has got to be a good thing for all of us, because the kind of vulnerabilities we were talking earlier on, whether you're very young, whether you've got personal grievances and a lack of protective factors around you, or whether you're mentally ill, the easier it is for you to access the material, the worse it is for all of us. So I don't take, the deflection point for me is I'd rather be in that space. In terms of what's the scale of the problem, well, if Twitter can take down 1.9 million pieces in 3 months, I wouldn't describe it as quite big. I would describe the whole problem as being very big. Now, where I can't give you exact figures is I don't know of that 1.9 million, how many of those were fantastic quality pieces of serious terrorist material that had to be removed, or whether it was all swept up by the algorithm. So I can't get that because I don't own that information, Twitter own that information, but it's still a fantastic step in the right direction. So my point about trying to get these people to work with us is that is a clear demonstration of a major provider wanting to do something positive. I want to keep encouraging them to do that, not continue to call them out.
I think we would completely understand your perspective on this. I think we perhaps don't feel quite so constrained in the pressure not to call them out, and think that for us, in terms of understanding actually the sort of facts about what's happening, are you saying that they are sharing information, they are sharing, visual images and so on across platforms? Because previously, when we had pursued this, they weren't, and we had, YouTube recognising that a video was illegal, but then not sharing that with Facebook and Twitter, who were then not taking the same thing down.
I will get you an answer to that question because I can't say it off the top of my head. What I do know is the big six sit in a room together discussing these kind of problems. I don't know what kind of solution they've reached because that is not that is a meeting that's organised by the industry itself. So it's not a meeting I'm in. But I will get an answer to that particular question. I hope that we've reached that point. What we do run as part of the policing service is we run a filtering list. We run a filtering list for all kinds of other agencies, not just other media companies. And that filter list includes shared imagery that we would want taken down. So we're currently running that filtering list. In an ideal world, you're quite right, we'd want those organisations to be running and managing that filtering list amongst themselves. But I don't know whether they're doing that yet. But I'd be interested to ask them the question.
Wouldn't you expect them to be, though? I mean, this feels like pretty basic to us. You know, we've got something that everybody agrees is illegal. It appears on one platform, and it is just sharing the technology so that it can be automatically taken down from other platforms as well. That sort of feels like, the first basic steps to dealing with this.
Totally agree. So I agree that's basic. I would expect them to be doing that. I hope they are. Where it's illegal content, certainly all of them agree with the fact that where it's clearly illegal content, they want it removed. And those big six have been cooperating with our CTIU consistently. Obviously, we have lots of problems with much smaller platforms who are very difficult to engage with. But the big companies who have the biggest influence in this area, they have been cooperating. So yes, I would expect them to be doing that basic thing. But I will get you a definitive answer on it.
That would be helpful. The other thing we found when we pursued this some time ago was that YouTube in particular told us they effectively were not doing as much on far-right extremism and illegal material. They had put a lot of investment into Islamist extremism, but not far-right extremism. Is that your perception, or do you think they are now dealing appropriately with all threats?
We're certainly asking them to deal appropriately with all threats, as we're asking ourselves to deal appropriately with all threats. So I think counter-terrorism policing has always been very clear that regardless of the ideology, we want to fight it and take it down. We've been very clear about that. We now know that MI5 and JTAC have joined that particular fray, and we are working exactly the same as we've worked against the Islamist jihadist threat for a long period of time on the extreme right-wing threat. We're back in the sort of where's the grey area. So if it's criminal, absolutely. If it's not criminal, I think everyone is struggling with what does that mean for censorship. I think those big companies will be wondering what that means for corporate social responsibility and moral duty versus what is actually criminal versus, you know, their other duties as a non-censoring platform in a democracy. And I have some sympathy with that. I don't have an answer to that. I would like to see anything, particularly the stuff you read out, not be available to large sections of the community. Unfortunately, if it doesn't break the law, I can't do anything about that. But society should stand up and challenge it.
Part of the reason we wanted to obviously ask you so much about the far-right extremism is because this is part of an inquiry we're close to concluding around hate crime, which obviously you referred to the links between hate crime and far-right extremism. Could you say a little bit more about that?
It might be a bit of a personal view, and you'd probably want to ask criminologists, but I would have thought that as a proxy for where the country is going in terms of tolerance, rising hate crime must be seen as a very disturbing indicator of that. Where I see that the biggest rise in that hate crime is in religiously aggravated offending. So we only started recording that properly in policing and really enforced it in 2015, so it's very early to be definitive about trends. But a 40% increase last year, that's not recording practice, that's an increase in offending. So I think that's my kind of big concern, that effectively, and what I also know, because community leaders tell me this, is that that kind of hate crime against, whether it's Islamophobia or anti-Semitism, fuels a personal grievance as well. So not only is it wrong, but it's actually contributing to people who might be vulnerable to be drawn into Islamist jihadism, you know, who have not yet made up their mind, but are thinking, well, hang on, if it's one rule for them and it's one rule for me, it might be pushing me over the edge, and that's a deep concern to me.
So you would see tackling hate crime as actually also being about preventing escalating extremism of all kinds as well?
Yes, I think tackling hate crime is one of the most important things police officers can do. I'm all about threat, harm and risk. There's been quite a lot of media comment about we're being diverted towards hate crime. I think that media comment is largely around people who've never experienced it and have not experienced it on a daily basis, don't understand how pernicious it is, and probably don't understand what the long-term consequences of it are, which is a divided society. And that's got all kinds of, forget counter-terrorism policing, that's got all kinds of consequences for crime full stop.
And what do you see as being the main targets for far-right extremism in terms of the kinds of investigations and the kinds of cases that you've seen?
So, I mean, we've talked about the threat to individual politicians that we've seen. We've talked about one of the most common threats is public order-related violence, which quite often hasn't actually been instigated by the far right, but is because effectively they're promoting a kind of political message which isn't criminal, but which effectively attracts a great deal of counter-protest. It's in the counter-protest that's developed into public order situations. So that's a danger. That's not in the national security threshold, but it's where you get to the promoting a race war, promoting, effectively a white supremacist cult, and using violence to achieve those means. Then you are absolutely getting into a national security threshold, and that was national action. So effectively, that was the intelligence that underpinned their prescription, and that's what we were seeing. Now, I'm very grateful to live in a country where that is still the minority of the problem. What I don't want to see, and I certainly don't want my organisation to be complacent and let that get out of hand. And I think that's that's probably where we were 15, 16 years ago with ALM. And this is my point about where's a criminal threshold and where's the tolerance of extremist behaviour, and how long do you let that continue before it becomes a national security threat? That's a difficult judgment.
And then just final, the issue about the policing response to threats to public figures as well, and just actually the practical police response to threats on the ground. Are you aware of the failures that there have been in the West Yorkshire Police investigation of threats to Paula Sheriff? I'm
afraid. I've not been briefed on that at all.
Could I ask you to look into those and to come back to the committee, because we have had evidence, and I think it is in the public domain, about far-right threats to Paula Sheriff with long delays, and I think actually quite unacceptable delays in the investigation by West Yorkshire Police, and some mistakes in the handling of the investigation as well, which, given that this is obviously the next door constituency to Joe Cox's constituency, we would expect, I think, the police to take extremely seriously.
Yes, I know the Chief Constable very well. I will speak to her. I've not been personally briefed on that, but that is not something we would ever want to hear.
Thank you. John Woodcock.
Thank you, Chair. You said in your opening remarks that we should talk much more about prevent. So let's talk about prevent. Before you were imposed earlier this year, you spoke quite radically about the toxicity of prevent, how it ought to be housed outside of government, it ought to be independently reviewed. Is that still your view, and what are you doing?
I think whether prevent is independently reviewed or not is a matter for government, but I'll be very clear about what I meant by that. Prevent is, I've said it right at the start, it is the most important pillar of the strategy if long term we want to see some reduction in threat. And I think, and certainly my people on the front line will tell me, when they go out to try and talk about prevent in communities, it becomes very difficult. So I think the argument we thought previously was taking place was that toxicity was confined to small groups of people who had every reason to try and stop prevent as a tactic. I think that's had a more pernicious effect in wider communities. So it is, the toxification of prevent has happened in wider communities. So we need to rescue the image of prevent. We need to talk positively about it. The reason I was talking about an independent review is good cross-party consensus on prevent tactics, understanding exactly what happens in prevent, understanding that at its heart it is a safeguarding function, which we have been brilliant at over many decades in all kinds of multi-agency approaches, not the police, we as in multi-agencies, dealing with the safeguarding of children, which has become a complete, kind of mantra for everywhere from schools to health to policing to local authorities. We need to understand that that's what prevent is about. And every time somebody calls prevent toxic and tries to come up with a new brand or a new set of tactics, the tactics are exactly the same as the ones that are currently in place. And I'm not sure changing the brand of something when the tactics are the same is a particularly wise thing to do. But what it does need is more positive voices around it.
What should be different about the tactics?
Nothing. So that's what I'm saying. The current prevent tactics, which are about safeguarding vulnerable people, they should stay exactly the same. The people have come to me and said, you've got to change the name of prevent, but they haven't come up with any new tactics. So the tactics they come up with are often exactly the same tactics that are currently being employed, which is about working with grassroots organisations, with vulnerable people and communities. And prevent is voluntary, so it's working with people who want to be involved with prevent to actually give them a different view on life. And those tactics are very sound, work very effectively, and speaking to those kind of grassroots providers in communities would give people a different view of prevent, I think.
Do you think that part of the problem has been that people in positions of responsibility, senior police officers, members of parliament, have not been prepared to talk up the good of what prevent is trying to do?
Yes, absolutely. But I don't actually think that that's a fantastic way forward either, because unfortunately the people who are using the message that prevent is toxic and you should steer clear from it are also promoting the message that of course the state would say that. So me saying it's a really positive thing, and it is, and that's what I'm saying, doesn't have the same effect as a really impressive local community leader saying the same thing. So we do need to make sure that we have a lot of different voices. I'm particularly energised by the fact that we have a Mayor of London who called it the only show in town. And I'm particularly energised that when the new Home Secretary launched Contest 4, talked, you know, the percentage of his speech which was about prevent, and some very moving words about prevent, showed how important it was to the new contest strategy. The new prevent delivery plan that is part of that Contest 4 deserves to be looked at in detail. So yes, I think politicians and senior police officers should talk positively about it. Simon Cole's my lead for prevent. He talks positively about it all the time, and he's also all over social media talking about it. My point is, that's not been enough. We have left a vacuum where we haven't got enough voices which are community voices, not state voices, talking positively.
Do you have confidence that beyond what you've said, which I can understand why you would cite as very important positive examples, do you have confidence that there is a plan in place, or there is an infrastructure in place that could deliver a plan to get those sufficient of those voices to change the tide on perceptions?
Yeah, I'm confident the plan exists because I've read it in detail and reread it preparing for this. So just to check that I agreed with it, I do. I think it's a pretty comprehensive plan. I've got a great deal of respect for the Director of Prevent in Home Office OSCT. He works very closely with my National Coordinator and with Simon Cole. So we do have a joined up piece around this. Of course it needs to be well resourced, and of course it's really difficult. So I've got some sympathy with, I'm calling for, you know, moderate, influential community voices to stand up and back prevent. But I understand how difficult that is when you're living in that community. We've talked about hate speech on the internet. These people are threatened, you know, threats to life as a result of standing up and supporting. You know, they need to know that they've got the support of the state behind them. That doesn't often help them, because actually it actually adds petrol to the problem.
Sure.
So I'm sympathetic. The plan's there. It needs to be properly resourced. It needs to be directed into the areas where it most counts, because we all have limited resources. But that is one of the crucial bits of prevent, is we need to stop leaving this vacuum for people who would seek to attack it to come in. And I would much rather see that it had cross-party support.
Yeah.
So this committee is a good place to look at it. I think Dominic Grieve may be writing to this committee to ask you to do exactly that.
Interesting, thank you. Yeah, can I ask you briefly about Anjem Chowdhury and could you say a little about the operational cost of keeping the public safe from the harm he could do? We've heard a lot about a monetary figure, but talk to us about the operational cost and resources of doing that.
Yeah, so every tactic that's used against a radicaliser, and I really like the fact that my predecessor called them groomers the other day, because that's what they are. Mm-hmm. They are looking to influence vulnerable people. Every minute that we spend having to look at somebody like that is a minute taken away from a priority operation with an extant threat. Mm-hmm. So it is not a great position to be in, but nevertheless, that particular organisation that he works for, and you'll note I refuse to use his name in public, that organisation is of significant concern to us as a counter-terrorism community. And we want to make sure that all the great work that went into breaking that organisation and breaking their momentum last year is maintained.
Australia, if I may briefly check, Australia has recently introduced legislation that calls post-sentence preventative detention of high-risk terrorist offenders, which would you find it useful if the UK had something like that on the statute book, which would enable someone like Anjem Chowdhury to remain in custody rather than being released at the end of his, not even at the end of his sentence, halfway through his sentence, less than halfway through his sentence?
So a couple of comments on that. I think we need to be really careful when we talk about legislation in terrorism. So I'm kind of sympathetic to the view that every piece of terrorism legislation should go through huge scrutiny before it's put on the statute book. Mm-hmm. And then when it's on the statute book, it should continue to go under extreme scrutiny. Once you've had attacks, it's always a really dangerous place to start talking about legislation. I've no doubt about that. You haven't tested me on the Counter-Terrorism and Security Bill, but I'm on record of giving evidence to the Bill Committee. That was fine-tuning, but one of the fine-tunings was significant sentences for preparatory acts. So increased sentencing on certain crimes that we have seen through our experience have been preparatory to major offending. They're not minor acts, but quite often we have to intervene much earlier. So the point is, some of our radicalisers getting short sentences, coming out early and being able to continue is a problem. Not having sufficient resources in place to use desistance or disengagement programs. So it's good that the government have invested in one of those for convicted terrorists to allow the ability to try and disengage terrorists from terrorist ideology and offending. That has had mixed success around the world, but we need to continue looking at that. Actually, continuing to lock people up when they've served their time, where there is no current existing intelligence that they are offending, is a real problem for society. I think I wouldn't support that.
That's interesting. Thank you. Finally, I promise. Are you content that so few people, returnees from Syria, have been prosecuted?
So few
returnees from Syria have been prosecuted?
The reality is we've had very few returnees where we've had a case where we could prosecute. The difficulty is, if I haven't got the evidence to prosecute them, I haven't got the evidence to know whether they're guilty or not. A lot of people came back in the early days who had gone for reasons which, they're not my concern really. The 40% that came back quickly, they're not my concern. My real concern is the people who are battle-hardened terrorists, who've been fighting and who are committed to that fight. Should they seek to come back, or should they start to come back? They are a huge concern. That is the big national security threat. We need to ensure we've got good evidence around those, and that is not always simple.
I absolutely understand that someone who is trained to fight is a bigger risk than someone who is going to. However, is it not a concern that people have been able to go and support what is clearly a terrorist organisation working against the British state and are allowed to return and are not being prosecuted because of insufficient evidence?
Yes, it's absolutely a concern. I think one of the Australian pieces of legislation that's well worth looking at is the designated area offence, but that's not going to be retrospective. No. So it's a lesson learned for Syria, but for future conflict, we should definitely consider that.
Sure. Thank you.
Stuart Rond.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Assistant Commissioner. Turning now to the question of funding, we've got a budget obviously coming up, so ideal opportunity for you to set out your shopping list, as it were. And you've already spoken about one issue, which I think you said there's a longer-term funding settlement needed. How does it work just now, and what sort of length of funding settlement is it that you'd be looking for?
So it would be easy to have a funding settlement that was over 5 years, that was manoeuvrable and could. So I've got 2 huge ICT projects, which are fundamental to how we gather, store, structure and analyse data. So having to go back every year for the next increment of funding to fund projects that need to be planned over multi-year timeframes is very difficult. Having to go back every 12 months to fund recruitment, which often takes longer than that, particularly in my sphere because of vetting criteria, is very difficult. It's a bit analogous. When I was a borough commander, I remember a lot of charities that we were supporting at the time would spend 9 months of their 12 months fighting to get funding just to survive for the next year. I find it a bit like that. So I've been in counter-terrorism for 4 years, and I can't think of a time where I wasn't having to prove that I, demand analysis or budget or was required on a yearly basis while still fighting the threat at the tempo I've described. I'm not sure that's a great model. So that's why I've said it. A longer-term funding settlement would be useful. What I would say is I prefer doing my negotiations behind closed doors and not in public. And what I've found this year, particularly because everyone has been so shocked by 2017, is a very sympathetic year. So I've got what used to feel a bit like having my homework marked is now much more of a team effort. So in terms of my lead department in the Home Office, do they understand the demand? And I have my colleagues in MI5 to thank for this, because of course a lot of that demand analysis comes from the TS space and has to be shared. So we have very detailed metrics which talk about the demand. So although I give you broad figures in public, we know, in detail what it's costing us, how much it's costing us, what the unit cost is, and just exactly what that threat tempo looks like. And all of that we've been through that alongside the Home Office in fine detail, and they recognise the pressure we're under. I have no doubt whatsoever this Home Secretary, this Permanent Secretary, this Director General and their finance teams understand exactly the pressure we're under.
Okay, that's encouraging.
It is very encouraging.
But while I appreciate you wanting to have most of these discussions behind closed doors, I'll have to probe you a little bit further in public, I'm afraid. You spoke a little about 700 investigations ongoing, and if I understand correctly, there's around 20,000 people who have previously been investigated and who could conceivably still pose a threat. That's clearly resource intensive. So, based on what you just said there, you are saying that more resources are needed, but you're confident of securing them this time round?
Well, we made the case for increased resources last year as part of the National Security Capability Review. So that was accepted that those resources would be required, but we got a one-off settlement for that year. And that's what's created the problem. So effectively, we got that funding settlement for this year. It's created the space for us to grow, and I'm recruiting at speed because of that. What I didn't get was that baked into the baseline for next year. So effectively, my baseline for next year will collapse. Right. And so what I need is the baseline to be effectively what we need to sustain the network that we need to grow. And that's more people in intelligence and investigations. You know, our pressure on surveillance and digital media exploitation is huge. It's the money to underpin the ICT programs to make us better at the way we deal with data, which was a fundamental conclusion of the Operational Improvement Review. So these are things, and as I said, you know, I don't have to argue those points with the Home Office. They accept that that's what's required. Now what's required is a Treasury that's sympathetic.
Yeah, sure. You've also said that your work depends also on well-resourced local police forces, and I think that's a point your predecessor also made. I think we have some fears based on evidence we received during our Policing for the Future inquiry that local police forces are really struggling with resources to do all the work that has been asked of them. Is that a discussion that you've been involved in as well about the importance of increased funding for local police forces?
Absolutely. So don't forget, in my position I represent 43 Chief Constables, 9 of which sit on the Counter-Terrorism Committee. They are the Chief Constables who lead for their regions in counter-terrorism, but they also run police forces. So I'm very much aware across those 43 forces there are some forces that have absolutely reached probably the bottom of where they can be. So you might call it efficiency in terms of what they've managed to reduce their budgets to. I wouldn't necessarily call it effective. So if I was parochial and just talked about counter-terrorism policing, Mark commissioned a very good piece of work post-Westminster and Manchester, which said what was the total cost and what were the types of resources used in the opening hours and opening days and opening weeks of those 2 particular attacks. And 70% plus of that was nothing to do with counter-terrorism policing. So it doesn't matter how confident I am about my budget, if wider policing isn't well resourced, we're not going to be able to cope with an attack. Simply because, I mean, Salisbury is a great example. 42 forces provided resources to keep the Salisbury investigation going, and that was nothing to do with my detectives. So 9 regional counter-terrorism units provided 250 detectives, but actually the vast majority of the police forces in this country all had to supply local officers to man cordons. And of course, there's a wider piece there about community reassurance. So we know from our own polling in counter-terrorism policing that when the public want to report something suspicious and they're nervous about it, the first people they're going to turn to, and we're really proud of the fact that policing is right up there in the top 2 people to, you know, if you can't turn to your family, you'll turn to local policing. It's local policing, not counter-terrorism policing or the anti-terrorism hotline. It's local policing. So when we talk about local to global, that's what we mean. We mean the local Bobby on the beat in his or her community, speaking to the community every day, giving them confidence that policing's on their side, taking reports all the way up to my counter-terrorism police liaison officers in 50 countries worldwide. You know, we need that kind of stretch in order to defeat what we're currently facing.
And following up on one of the points you just made there, the Home Secretary, in a similar vein, spoke about resources having to be focused in the locations where the threat from terrorism and radicalisation was the highest. How do you go about doing that, and how easy is it to sort of move funds to where they're needed, given, you know, the speed and pace of change?
How easy is it to do that? Not easy because of the pace. And that's the same with funding new capabilities. That's the same with, we do need to be much more agile, which is the point about having long-term funding settlements to do that. The decision about, it depends what you're talking about. If you're talking about prevent, that's a Home Office OSCT-led directive about where that goes. It should be done in consultation with Chief Constables and with Counter-Terrorism policing. In terms of pursue, I've said the actual ratios of where the threat is have remained broadly consistent. If we see the threat rising in certain areas, what we have is a fantastic network that we've developed over 10 years, in which there is, effectively, within a day, we can deploy through a whole range of counter-terrorism policing skills to an area to support them on an almost indefinite basis, depending on where the next threat comes from. That's the power of the network. So the network isn't all about Wales having to cope by themselves, it's not all about West Midlands having to cope by themselves. The network, they buddy up across borders so that they already have immediate resilience. They also work interoperably with their organised crime colleagues, which is was very important in 2017. And my thanks to Lynn Owens and her teams in the National Crime Agency, not just the regional organised crime units, but we work very effectively as a team there as well. But actually those 9 counter-terrorism units and the support of Police Scotland and Police Service of Northern Ireland, incredibly effective as a way of surging when required.
And very finally, on question of resources, you've spoken about the importance of the Counter-Terrorism Internet Referral Unit. Again, hell of a resource intensive. Do you have the funding that is required to do that job properly? And how much easier would it be, and how would that sort of unit change what it is doing if more of the sort of burden was on the internet companies instead of your staff?
I'm in danger of reopening that very detailed debate again, so you've hit the nail on the head. I think part of our growth bid was in that space, but I want that growth bid to be investigators, not flaggers of material. So yes, it would help us enormously with social media companies to take that burden away from us and actually just report the things that we needed to investigate. What that unit has been very successful in doing is putting its operating method on the world stage. So Europol copied it. That model is now in France, it's in Germany, it's in Spain, it's in Belgium, I think it's in Italy as well. And we are trying to spread it worldwide.
Does it have the resources it needs? Does it have the financial resources it needs, would you say?
It was part of the growth bid of last year. So yes, if we get a settlement that we want, and as I said, I've got a lead department that's sympathetic, it will have the resources that it needs. It would be greatly assisted by your point.
Thank you.
Stephen Dowden.
Chair, you've mentioned the costs and implications of the Salisbury case a number of times in your evidence so far, Assistant Commissioner, and obviously we've seen also the horrific Khashoggi case although it took place in Turkey. I'm certainly aware of individuals who are alleged to have been involved in that, having been in this building, in fact in my office just above here, and other individuals perhaps operating for foreign states in and out of this building on a number of occasions. Could you just give us an idea of the scale of the threat that we face from foreign state agents potentially involved in acts of terror, hybrid attacks, or indeed, just plain murder and assassination?
I can't, because it's not my place to give that assessment. It's the security services.
Mm-hmm. But in terms of the resources that are required from you to potentially have to deal with those situations.
So Salisbury was probably the most complicated, most resource-intensive case of my career.
Okay.
So huge.
Okay, and are you concerned about the safety of individuals attending sort of embassies and consulates here in London? Perhaps of high-profile figures going into them, journalists and others. Are there risks to the public or individuals who might be living in the UK, perhaps as a safe haven from states operating on our soil here in London?
So it would be very difficult to give a kind of general view about whether there was a threat, other than to say we work on specific intelligence. So there isn't currently specific intelligence against individuals. If there was, we would deal with that specific intelligence. So certainly when Salisbury happened, there was a need to understand whether there was a threat to other potential people who might have connections or problems with the state. So hostile state activity. If there is, if individuals have concerns and come forward, we deal with them on an individual case-by-case basis. The fact is that I think the point you're making is if that ramped up into we had to protect a lot of individuals, is that costed into our current resourcing model? The answer to that is no, it's not. Okay. This is all additional work.
And can I ask you then specifically with regard to this place? Obviously, we regularly have in here. I mean, I hosted a meeting of, for example, Chechen individuals who are very critical of the Russian regime in here. I'm sure many of us have hosted individuals who would be of interest to outside influences. Are you concerned that there are allegedly individuals operating in here who haven't gone through the proper security clearances and of the backlog of security clearances for access to this place that exists at the moment?
I'm not sure how to answer that in a public forum, so I think we've got possibly, I would say this, the best security services in the world. They're the people who monitor that kind of intelligence. If they had concerns about specific individuals, they would be asking in the same way that we do with all other threats. We act as a partnership. They would be asking police to lead on investigation. They would lead on intelligence. So I can't answer what the intelligence picture looks like. I can only answer what I know, which is, have I been asked to do specific investigations? I'm absolutely convinced that we would have that kind of partnership.
Okay, and that partnership exists with the services here?
Yes, absolutely.
And just to ask one other case, just going back to the threats that you raised at the beginning and the attacks from 2017. Can I just ask you about the case of one of the London Bridge attackers who was stopped at Bologna Airport and prevented from travelling to Turkey and whose name was on the Schengen system. We obviously had the Manchester bomber who was known to intelligence agencies and who travelled repeatedly between Libya and the UK in the period before the attack. How were these individuals still able to travel freely in and out of the UK? Are you concerned about the interaction between some of this intelligence and the work of the border force?
This is about watch listing, and watch listing is a security service responsibility about who goes on that watch list. It is about the policy that underpins who goes on the watch list and under what criteria. They have answered that in detail in front of the Intelligence Security Committee on both of those issues. There is no doubt whatsoever that the interaction between Border Force, security services, counter-terrorism policing, National Crime Agency and wider policing has to be as tight as possible. Is it perfect? No, it's not. It needs work. There is no doubt about it. And it probably needs resourcing, and there are a lot of reasons why that needs to improve rapidly.
So in those cases, your view is that this was actually just simply about decisions about whether these individuals should have been on watch lists as opposed to any wider failure of communication between the border force and the police or in the way in which other organisations responded.
In Abedi's case, it was a matter of policy that he was not watch listed when he went to Libya. So that was a policy decision that was taken at the time. And whether or not that was the correct policy decision or not, it was a decision that was rationalised against that policy. That policy has changed, so now effectively what we now see is a policy which says should somebody, there needs to be a good reason why they're not watch listed, not the other way around, if that makes sense. Okay. Zagbo is different because there was a problem in terms of the way he was watch listed by the Italian authorities. It was on the wrong system. Effectively, there were process failures, which were individual failures, not policy failures.
Okay. And then just sticking with the issues about obviously the interaction with the borders and people moving between different countries, what's your assessment at the moment of the impact that Brexit will have on the counter-terror work?
Not as dramatic as it will be for my core policing colleagues because we don't work at the same volume. So we work in a very high niche, high threat, low volume space. And we work very much on bilateral relationships, which have developed over a long period of time, largely because obviously counter-terrorism, national security effectively is a state responsibility, not an EU responsibility. So a lot of our relationships are security service to security service, and I'm very proud to say counter-terrorism policing to our police counterparts. Often that is a significant source of police-to-police cooperation. We still need the same tools and techniques that you will have probably heard from, I'm sure you will have heard from Lynn and from Sarah Thornton talking about what's actually required in the high volume space. So things like Schengen, the ability to share data across borders. Terrorism, like any other crime, probably more so than a lot of other crimes, is a cross-border transnational problem. It isn't just through the internet, it's through the movement of people. So knowing that people are moving, knowing that they're coming, so passenger name records would be a huge issue for us. Were we to lose that particular facility, that would be very problematic. You want to keep your threat as far away as possible and to see it coming as soon as possible. That's what that gives us the ability to do. Shared investigations, really important, so the kind of joint investigation team philosophy, that we can actually work alongside our partners in Europe and discuss investigations, that's really important. The future of PRUM and the sharing of biometric data, again, because it's a cross-border crime, and we've had good examples of where, and particularly from Five Eyes relationships, which are probably sort of deeper and longer simply because of how they started and when they started. We've had good examples of that sharing of biometric information in the terrorism space. We'd want that in Europe as well.
And arrest warrants?
Yes,
obviously,
and that was going to be my
comments from the NCA, yesterday. I think it was very serious comments about that.
So that would have been my final point. The European arrest warrant, which, again, because we work at low volume, and we could still rely on Interpol red notices and MLAT procedures and 1957 Extradition Act. If you look at where European arrest warrants took us to a matter of weeks, as opposed to many months, if not years, to extradite people, that is a sitting risk for that length of time. So that's got to be a problem. So I think what we'd say is the core of the security deal. We've been very clear to government about the operational requirements that are necessary, and my understanding is I haven't seen the full security paper, but my NPCC colleagues who are leading on it have. That contains everything we would require to be operationally match fit. It's now a matter for governments to negotiate that position.
Just as part of that, how significant is the SIS-2 information system as part of that?
Again, for us it's still significant, so we would argue SIS along with EAW, PRUM, passenger name records would be our real concerns in counter-terrorism. But SIS for core policing, hugely problematic if we lost that.
And so what preparation are you doing from a counter-terror point of view for a no deal?
So we've got my lead for that sits on the NPCC committee, which is putting in place measures if we have a no deal. But we also have our own separate committee that's looking at each one of those areas that I've just described and saying what is it that we would need to do to put ourselves back in a position to cope. Now, bilateral relationships through the security service and our police-to-police relationships help. However, losing our embeds in various countries around the world would be distressing.
And given the NAO report on the no-deal preparations, which talks about loss of access to security tools, creating security gaps, less information at the border to be able to intercept people or goods who provide a security risk, and their estimate is that even if all mitigating actions are put in place, UK capabilities will still be reduced. Do you think that having no deal will cause significant problems for counter-terror work?
Not as significant as my wider policing colleagues. So yes, it will be significant, but not as significant. It was particularly the loss of some of those particular tools would be problematic for us, yes.
Rem Chishti?
Yes, Chair. Just following on from the point you made by my colleague John Woodcock, with regards to the returning fighters, I understand there's around 400 of those British citizens who've gone to fight with Daesh and are now back in the United Kingdom. From your expertise and the information that you have, do you feel that you have adequate handle on them, and have you adequately been able to identify how much of a danger they pose? And linked to that very point, there's also a dozen or so of those individuals, if you speak to experts such as Peter Neal from King's College London, who are being held by the Kurdish forces. And from your point, these are British citizens. Should they be brought back, or should they be dealt with out in that jurisdiction?
So on the first point, those that we know of, that we clearly become a source of investigation for us. So yes, I'm satisfied that the people that we know who travelled and the people that we know who returned, we have coverage on. But let me be clear, I'd be a foolish person, and anyone would be foolish to give a 100% guarantee that we had full coverage and we could stop everything. That's just not a possibility and not a real world problem that we have got. And of course, 2 people from the closed space attacked us last year, so people that we no longer consider a national security threat are also a problem for us. If we consider them a national security threat, they'd be in the 3,000, they'd be in the top acute, there'd be a priority operation for ourselves and MI5, and I'd be very satisfied that we are doing the very best we can to give the highest level of assurance and coverage of those individuals. So if anyone was listening and wanted to come back to this country, you will be targeted by the might of law enforcement and the security services in this country if you have proved to be a national security threat. Of course, that's assuming that we know everyone who travelled and everyone who came back. That's the difficulty. Your second point, which is, should they... So there's a very clear government policy on whether people should come back or not. From a counter-terrorism policing perspective, every individual who comes back where we haven't got a case to prosecute them becomes another priority operation and becomes a significant threat, not least because they are removing resources from current operations. So if they have committed horrific offences against another country and another people, my view is they should be tried in the jurisdiction for which they've been arrested in. If they are sole British citizens and they have no other nationality, well, government policy is clear. They have to come back here, and they effectively become a national security risk. We have to look about whether we've got a case to prosecute them. If we haven't got a case to prosecute them, they become an operation.
Can I just ask a question on that? You say it's the government policy that they should come back, but from a resource perspective, from a policing perspective, from an intelligence perspective, would you say they're better off being left out there and being dealt with in that jurisdiction rather than come back?
From a resource perspective, yes. The moral perspective is a difficult one to argue. If you can't make someone stateless, we know that. So if you've got a UK passport and you are a British citizen, you are entitled to return to this country. But if you have committed atrocities in another country and you are capable of being tried in that country under their laws, that's where you should face justice.
And the first duty of the state is always to protect its citizens and do what you think is appropriate in that regard.
It is.
Assistant Commissioners, thank you very much for the evidence that you have given us and for your time. I think there were a couple of areas where it would be helpful if you were able to provide us with further information, including on, in response to Douglas Ross's question about the level of coordination between social media companies and some of the work that is underway. Also about the investigation into the threats against Paula Sheriff, and I'd be particularly keen to understand whether the regional CTU has been involved, given that it's obviously about far-right extremist threats. And the reason it would be very helpful if you could give us your assessment of that case is because this reflects a wider issue that we pick up where the experience of public figures who are targeted doesn't quite fit with some of the things that you're saying about what the police intention is in terms of providing support and providing and pursuing investigations into some of those far-right threats as well. And then the any further information that you have on any of the points that we've raised would obviously be extremely welcome as well. Can I, but thank you again both for your evidence this afternoon, but also and through you to all of your teams as well for the hugely important work that you are doing, which is so important to public safety. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.
I welcome Sarah Khan to give evidence as the lead commissioner for countering extremism. Could you just set out for us first what you see as being the most important parts of your role and what you are prioritising at the moment?
Well, firstly, thank you for inviting me to give evidence today, Chair. I want to briefly just set out, in order to answer your question, the work of the Commission. I was appointed in January. The Commission was formally launched in March. I bring to this role 10 years' worth of grassroots experience, having run a women's NGO, a women's counter-extremism NGO. The Commission launched in March, as I said, and engagement underpins everything that the Commission does. So over that length of time, I have visited around 13 towns and cities across England and Wales. I've spoken to about 400 experts and activists and civil society groups and others. And I've also set up an expert group to specifically advise and challenge the work of the Commission. The aim of the Commission is to help everyone do more to challenge extremism. I believe that extremism is a whole society problem. It therefore requires a whole society response. And we've set out, as is outlined in the Commission's charter, the key objectives for this first year, which is to engage widely, is to produce a wide-ranging study into extremism, looking at all forms of extremism, and thirdly, to go back to the Home Secretary and highlight and identify key recommendations on what role the Commission should play, what should be its long-term function, its structure, and so forth. We published last month the terms of reference for the study. There are 5 key themes that we want to look at. That includes the scale of extremism in our country, the harms that extremism is having in our country, understanding and analysing the objectives and wider evolving tactics of extremists, understanding the public's perception of extremism, and finally looking at the government's response to extremism in particular, and also possibly reviewing their definition as well. So we've been very busy. We've held workshops with both supporters and critics alike, and it's been very, very insightful. But I suppose for me personally, what I've found really interesting is going around the country and hearing people's experiences of extremism. And I have to say that people in this country are deeply concerned about what they perceive to be rising extremism.
Can you talk about how far your focus is on Islamist extremism and how far on far-right extremism?
I've made clear that this Commission has to look at all forms of extremism. So we know that the greatest threats come from both Islamist and the far right, but I've also spoken to academics, practitioners and others who have specialism in hard left extremism, Sikh extremism, Hindu extremism, and so I'm very keen to look at it in a very broad way, because I think if you do it that way, you start to see similar tactics that extremists employ. You start to see similar objectives that extremists use, and so I think that's really important. And again, I feel that having spoken to, for example, members of the Sikh community who are deeply concerned about what they perceive to be Sikh extremism, the intimidation and bullying that's happening within and among different Sikh communities, that's something that we should also look at. I feel the Commission has a responsibility to look at all forms of extremism.
Kate Green.
You said a moment ago that you see tackling extremism as an issue for the whole of society, and indeed that's a message that was echoed recently by the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, who, in response to the report that he had commissioned on tackling extremism and hate speech, spoke about the wish in Greater Manchester to develop a new whole society approach. What do you think are the characteristics of such an approach?
I think he's right that we have to have a whole society approach to it. Sir Mark Rowley, the former Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, also very much argued this point. Extremism impacts all of us, and it's one of those issues which crosses over into so many different areas. So I see the role of schools and education, for example, is vital. Teaching children critical thinking skills is important. Teaching children about equality and human rights and diversity, again, helping to build resilience amongst young children is important. So schools and teachers have an incredibly important role to play. Faith leaders, and many of them are doing fantastic work in challenging extremism, challenging ideological narratives using theology. I've seen that in practice and I've seen how effective that is. Government, of course, has a role to play. The government has published a counter-extremism strategy back in 2015. There's a top-down approach, but of course there's the bottom-up approach, which is the civil society response as well. What can civil society organisations be doing? And again, I've met incredible civil society groups who are either really actively exposing and challenging extremists, or those organisations which are working to build resilience. What I would say is that, having spoken to a number of different civil society organisations over the last few months, just how much abuse they get for doing this work, the hostility, the backlash for people who are actively trying to challenge extremism, challenging bigotry and hatred. And there's a really hostile climate out there facing counter-extremists. And others who then say to me, we know that the work that you're saying we need to do is important, but when we look at the climate that exists out there, we don't want to put our head above the parapet. So I want to look at what more can we do to enable, empower and support counter-extremists, who I believe are the backbone of our country and our unsung heroes.
I'd like to come back to that in a moment, but first of all, can I ask you, you talked about schools having a role, education, civil society, all of which I think we would agree with, but you'll be aware, I'm sure, that in the report that was commissioned by Andy Burnham, one of the things that his commission identified was the real importance of investment in community resources. It highlighted in that report, for example, the lack of youth provision, which was having a detrimental effect on young people and therefore the potential for them to be drawn into terrorist activity. It noted that reductions in public services have increased isolation and really separation within and between communities. Do you agree that that is an issue, that underinvestment in public services, and is that a point you're raising with government?
I've obviously heard a number of these different concerns, particularly around youth. I was in Portsmouth recently, where a youth worker was telling me that he worked with very, very vulnerable kids who are the type of kids who are going to be drawn into violence, knife crime, gang crime, possibly even being killed. And so he's working with those type of children. And he said to me that he feels that firstly organisations like his don't receive enough funding and enough support. And also he felt that if the far right, and I quote, actually got their act together in his particular area, he feels he would have lost a generation of young kids. This is something that I am deeply concerned about. One of the things that we want to examine as part of the study is a cross-cutting theme, which is the drivers of extremism. So a lot of those issues, I think, will come up as we are gathering evidence over the next 6 months, something that we will be examining and looking at. I have to say, on the issue of around poverty and things like that, the evidence shows us that the picture is very complex. There is no single answer. We've seen how people from middle-class families who are very well educated, who've been to university, who are quite wealthy, have been drawn into extremism. And likewise, people who come from perhaps working-class backgrounds or families don't necessarily end up in extremism. So the picture is very complex, but it's something that we want to examine as part of our study.
When you talked a few moments ago about your 5 priorities, they came across as being very focused on behaviours around extremism and the ways in which people become drawn into extremist activity. There didn't seem to be much focus on these community engagement strategies and the way in which communities need to have the resources to support one another and to have confidence and trust between each other. You've now said that that is something, I think, that you're taking an interest in, but why is it not explicit in these 5 priorities?
I mean, I feel it is. I suppose in terms of the idea around understanding extremist ideas and behaviour, I would put those under theme 1, which is the public's understanding of extremism. The other themes, for example, looking at the scale of extremism, is looking at particular indicators which will highlight to us, for example, the relationship between hate crime and extremism, the understanding attitudes that people may have towards extremism, looking at incidences in regulated schools such as charities and other regulated spaces. So trying to get that information in terms of scale. But in terms of community engagement, we are asking the public to contribute to our public call for evidence. We're launching the first ever consultation because I believe passionately that we should give the people in this country an opportunity to tell us what they're experiencing in their areas. What do they feel is contributing to extremism, either that they're experiencing as individual, but also what they're seeing in their towns and cities. And we're going to be holding a number of different community engagement events. And as I said, I've been travelling around the country and speaking to people because, I feel very strongly that we need to hear from people themselves. And people have given me a whole range of different ideas of what they feel is driving extremism. But that kind of speaking to victims, speaking to counter-extremists, speaking to local authorities. I've had a number of productive meetings with the LGA, for example. That's very, very important to me, and we want to capture all of that as part of the study.
And do you feel there's a lack of trust in authorities, in statutory agencies, and I don't just mean criminal justice or security agencies, but perhaps in other statutory agencies too, for people to confide in or to raise their concerns, not just about specific extremist behaviours, but perhaps other risk factors that might leave people to feel isolated and become vulnerable?
I think we are witnessing growing distrust in our state institutions, in our wider democracy as well. The Commission has begun an ongoing review of current academic literature into the harms of extremism, and I have to say the evidence is quite limited, but what the evidence is showing us is that the harms of extremism is resulting in social exclusion, isolation, the breakdown of community cohesion, a justification for violence, but also a kind of distrust in our institutions. And what I think, particularly for the police and local authority, what concerns me is how extremists thrive in that particular situation, but also how they can drive extremism even further. And so it's quite complex, but this is something that we want to examine as part of the study.
And in your view, rightly or wrongly, and I appreciate it's not specifically in your remit, how much damage to trust is the PREVENT strategy doing in particular communities?
The PREVENT strategy is not part of my remit, as you've rightly pointed out. I do feel that if you engage widely and explain, and if the government explains to people, particularly to those communities who have fear and concern about the PREVENT strategy, and they build trust with those communities, there will be greater support for PREVENT, and that's really important. Trust, and I've heard this again from youth workers in Manchester who said to me, that trust is really important, but also going and speaking to communities and explaining what PREVENT is, showing how it's there to safeguard children, for example, is really important. But having that engagement is crucial.
Why has that not happened yet? Because this has been said about PREVENT for a number of years, that it's about safeguarding vulnerable young people, but it's not the perception of a number of these communities. So why is it taking so long and proving so difficult to build that trust?
I think that's probably a question you'd have to ask the Home Office and the government.
What are you hearing from communities as you go around the country?
Well, I mean, interestingly, when I've been going around and speaking to hundreds of people, it's interesting because I know PREVENT is a very important and lively debate at this moment in time, but when I've been speaking to people, actually the vast majority of people aren't speaking to me about PREVENT. They're actually talking to me about extremism, the harms that they're experiencing, how they feel it's radicalising young people, and I just kind of feel that, you know, I understand the importance of PREVENT, but I feel that we have to just take care and to consider that we don't go so much down the PREVENT discussion that we ignore the wider context of extremism and how extremism is increasing and is having a negative impact on the lives of people in this country and on our society as a whole.
And when you were appointed, there was criticism from a number of quarters to the effect that you were too close to the Home Office and that you wouldn't have the confidence of communities whose trust you would need to deliver a strategy effectively. How would you reassure people who have those concerns and suspicions?
Well, I think there's two things there. I think the first is the independence question. Prior to my role, as I mentioned earlier, I was director of a counter-extremism organisation. I criticised government when I didn't agree with government policy, and the best example I can give is actually the government's counter-extremism bill. I gave evidence to the Joint Committee of Human Rights, making clear my opposition to that bill because of freedom of expression concerns. But likewise, if there has been a government policy that I feel is right, I will support it. And so the need to have a PREVENT strategy, whatever flaws there are, is about PREVENT. The need to have a PREVENT strategy at a time when the terror threat is unprecedented is a strategy, an approach and a policy that I support. That's the approach I've taken with government in the past, and that's the approach I will take with in the future with the Commission. In terms of wide engagement with Muslims in this country, as an activist, I've spent the last 25 years engaging with Muslim voices, and particularly with young people and Muslim women whose voices we often don't hear. It's usually community leaders' voices we hear, and I've spent a lot of time speaking to people like that. I wasn't shocked by that response that I got to my appointment. I was disappointed, but I wasn't shocked because when I was director of Inspire, I learned pretty quickly that if you challenge extremism, if you defend human rights, if you advocate for gender equality, you will experience backlash and abuse. And so some of the criticisms I got were from people from that same quarter. But what I would say is that over the last couple of months, I have been speaking to, I've been engaging with Muslims across the country. I've been speaking to Muslim teachers and academics and civil society groups and women's groups and imams. I mean, I was up in Liverpool recently where I spoke to 10 imams from 10 different mosques. And also, I would also just highlight that I've spoken to the breadth that exists amongst British Muslims. So I've spoken to, on the one hand, very conservative and orthodox Muslims and imams, but also I've spoken to liberal and progressive Muslims. I've engaged with ex-Muslims. I've spoken to a whole range of different voices, including minorities within the minority of Muslims, such as the Shia community and also Ahmadiyyas. And so I take that engagement very seriously, but also to point out that I am engaging across the board with different faith communities, those with no faith communities, because that's important as my role as lead commissioner.
And you mentioned earlier the expert group that you've set up to advise and challenge the work of the Commission. Does that include people who have previously been critical of your stance?
There are people on there who are critical of the counter-extremism agenda. So people like Peter Tatchell, for example, he was part of the Defend Free Speech Alliance. He was very critical of the counter-extremism bill, as was Lord Anderson. I mean, he sits on there as well. I've chosen people who, again, both supporters and critics, who will advise and challenge me, but also who bring the whole breadth. You know, if I'm calling for a whole society response, I want people on there who are going to understand that wide challenge. So people like the Chief Executive of ISD, Sasha Havlicek, Jamie Bartlett, who specialise in online extremism and technologies, people like Sundar Kutwala of British Future, who understands the overlap between integration and extremism, individuals like Sir Mark Rowley, who looks at the overlap between extremism and terrorism on the other spectrum, and then again academics who specialise in human rights, women activists like Pragna Patel, who's been at the forefront of campaigning against fundamentalism and extremism as a whole for the last 38 years. So I've thought very long and hard about the group of people I want to advise and challenge me, and brought who I some of the best minds to that table who will do precisely that, who will advise and challenge me.
And finally, can I ask, do you feel you've got adequate resources to lead the Commission and conduct the research and the work that you wish it to carry out?
I think for this first initial year of the Commission, I do have enough resources. I do hope you'll ask me this question next year when I have to put recommendations to the Home Secretary and, of course, a budget about what I feel the future Commission should be. And I think that question will be a very important one when you ask me next time.
Stuart MacDonald.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming here once again today. Just to follow up on a couple of points that Kate Green asked you about. David Anderson, I think, was on record at one point as saying that he never really understood the intended purpose of your post. Why couldn't the Home Office just do the sort of thing that you're doing and assemble a panel of experts and produce policy? Why do we need a commissioner?
It's a good question. As you will be aware, the government published its first ever counter-extremism strategy in October 2015. I do feel the threat from extremism has evolved since that time, and I believe that the government felt it's good to have an independent person to look at this issue and also to bring a fresh pair of eyes. I don't think it's any surprise that extremism is a very complex and challenging issue. We are seeing a rise of extremism, I would argue both far right, particularly a far-right extremism. And so I actually think it's helpful and better for the government if they do have an independent voice who can advise and criticise and review government's work. So I'm keen to assess whether the government's counter-extremism strategy is effective. Is it making a difference? Is the government's definition of extremism helpful or not? Is it working? And so these are things that I want to consider as part of the study to ensure that we do have the right response to extremism.
You've mentioned that one of the reasons why you think this post has been established is because it brings independence, but as Kate Green said, one of the criticisms that's been made of your appointment is your perceived lack of independence from the Home Office. Now you've addressed that as best as you can, but the other sort of line of criticism that came forward at that time was about whether you had the necessary expertise for the post, just in terms of you don't have an academic background in this field or haven't conducted any research yourself, and some actually, I think in a letter sort of suggested that there hadn't even been a proper credible impact assessment of the work that you'd done with Inspire. How would you respond to those criticisms?
Independence, again, I've answered that question. I think the reason why that point kept coming up, and again, I think it's from people who don't actually know about the work that we've done. I mean, over 10 years, Inspire only had one project that was funded by the Home Office, and that was in 2015, an anti-ISIS Making a Stand campaign. And over 10 years worth of work, I think I find it interesting that people think that somehow doesn't make you independent. We know the Home Office over decades have funded NGOs over supporting vital work such as FGM campaigns or child sexual exploitation, a whole range of different issues. Nobody seems to question their independence because they've received a bit of funding from the Home Office. On the issue of expertise, well, again, I would push back. I've run and co-founded a counter-extremism organisation for the last 10 years. I've written a book about extremism. I've seen firsthand the tactics that extremists are using. I've written extensively about extremism. I've spoken to and delivered training to groups like Ofsted, and to deliver training to around 5,000 teachers across the country. So actually, I think my expertise speaks for itself, and anybody who actually looks at the work I've done over the last 10 years will know that's the case. I can't remember what your last point was.
Can I? But but could I ask you about the panel that you've appointed to sort of provide independent criticism? Now you've explained why a lot of those appointments are made and the expertise that they bring, but I think the point that we were trying to get at was whether or not you'd included in that any of the sort of groups who had been, or individuals who had been critical of your appointment as well, and would that not have been a sensible move if you've not done it?
The expert group is there to provide a very particular need and service to the Commission. I have already met a number of my critics already. I'm more than happy to do so. I've written to many of them quite early on in my appointment saying I'm more than happy to talk to you because I believe in engagement. I believe that if you have a disagreement with somebody, bring them round the table and have that discussion. And I've seen, and this really matters in terms of the counter-extremism space, because when I've spoken to former EDL supporters, for example, and they've said that when I did sit with a Muslim and had my views challenged, I realised actually I can be swayed. And so I want to set a very important stance in saying that, lead from the top and to ensure that we have that wide engagement and engage with our critics. I've held a number of workshops, for example, with free speech campaigners, human rights campaigners and organisations like Amnesty and others who are concerned about this area, some of whom may have been concerned about my appointment as well. But again, I'm more than happy to engage with them. But I think the expert group plays a very specific role in terms of advising, bringing their expertise to the table, because again, this issue is very complex and I want to ensure I have the best brains at that table to ensure we do try to address and reduce extremism in our country.
Okay, and the final question then is, how free do you feel to set your own agenda? And in particular, prevent seems to be off limits for you. Doesn't that sort of undermine the work of the Commission? I mean, that's central to this whole area of policy, and yet you're not able to properly include it in your study.
I think that's a very important question. The Charter outlines our independence. We have the authority and the power to meet who we want, to set whatever questions we want, to ask whatever questions we want, and to publish whatever we like. Prevent is obviously part of the government's counter-terrorism strategy. My role is counter-extremism. But obviously in the real world, we know it's not so black and white like that. Clearly, in some cases, extremism will lead on to violence and terrorism. My feeling very much is that we also need to just step back and ensure that we are looking at that wide spectrum of extremism. I am concerned that we do often get bogged down around the terrorism issue, and yes, of course that's important, but there is a wider spectrum, and I don't think we do actually understand the wider harms that extremism is having in our country, and so stepping back and ensuring we're looking at that properly is important. As I mentioned, I know there's a lively debate about prevent. My concern is, and I talked about the academic review we're doing, what we found so far is there is very limited evidence on extremism. There's insufficient research about the scale of extremism, the harm it's having. So I'm seeing a gap where we don't have enough evidence. We don't have enough evidence that's highlighting the scale, the harms, what's effective, what's not effective. Yet at the same time, we're seeing rising extremism. So I think for me, my focus has to be addressing the wider challenge of extremism, which I think for quite a long time we have not looked at it properly and sufficiently, which includes looking at the government's work, which includes reviewing the government's definition of extremism. And so I think that's quite a sufficient and significant amount of work that needs to be focused on first and foremost as my primary role.
Okay, thank you.
Look, it wasn't your decision, obviously, to rule prevent out of your remit, but isn't it a bit ridiculous? I mean, your remit includes to identify and challenge extremism in all its forms and provide the government with advice on the policies needed to tackle it. Well, how can that be possible if one great chunk of government policies that's designed to tackle it is off your agenda? And if you've got to engage widely and be prepared to work with those committed to confronting and responding to extremism in their communities, well, for a lot of those people, actually the issue of prevent is at the heart of what they're trying to do, either positively engaging with it or being troubled by it. I just don't see how you can do your job if prevent is excluded.
I agree with you. I think it's confusing and complex. I find it confusing when I speak to people on the ground. They find it confusing. You're right, I've not set that. What we have said is that in the short term, as part of the study, what we want to look at is what lessons can we learn from prevent. That's something that we're keen to do as part of the study. In the long term, I want, as part of me putting recommendations forward, this is one of the issues that I want to be considering and to put forward. But as I mentioned earlier, when I have been going around the country, most people have not been speaking to me about prevent. Ordinary people have actually been wanting to speak to me about extremism. But I agree with what you're saying. I think it is confusing, but this is something that I do want to consider and I will put forward as a recommendation.
And if you had to think about one thing that you think the government is doing best on counter-extremism and one thing that they're doing worst, what's the best thing and the worst thing that you think the government is doing at the moment?
I have to say it's quite a mixed bag. So when I speak to local authorities and councils, they are very supportive of the local community coordinators that are in post, that are working with local civil society organisations. Some have said to me that they found the role that they play is invaluable. The funding that the Home Office provides to the BSBT funding, the Building a Stronger Britain Together funding, which I think now funds around 230 organisations, civil society organisations, I think that is a good thing. My concern is, as I mentioned earlier, that strategy was put together in 2015. I think the threat from extremism has evolved. I'm not sure whether the strategy that was written then is appropriate for the time now. Is it addressing the challenges? How much of that work is actually countering online extremism? The scale of which is just, I can't even describe the scale of that. But also, are we doing enough in terms of actually countering extremist narratives and ideologies effectively enough? So I think there are certain questions that I certainly have, but there are certainly some good practices, but I just feel we need to just ensure that that strategy is fit for the time and the place and the challenge that is now in front of us.
Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Chair. Just there's been a lot of questions and discussions about the criticism you and your appointment have received. If, say at the end of your term in office, those criticisms still exist, has your time been a failure?
Well, I've already been meeting critics and I've already been having constructive discussions.
So do you think you're changing opinions?
Well, some people who are critical have met me and said they're very keen to get involved, to submit evidence to us. That's very important to me.
That doesn't mean you've changed their opinion, though.
No, it is, because if people are saying they don't want to engage with me, And now they're saying that we want to engage with the Commission, we want to work with you, we want to submit evidence, we want to organise roundtables for you to come and to speak to people in our area. That is changing minds and attitudes. And so,
but if you can't, will your time in office have been a failure? Well,
let's see what happens.
But if that is the outcome?
I think we have to be very careful on who we're basing the criticisms from. One of the points I've made before is that just because we shouldn't necessarily take the view of those who shout the loudest. Anybody in public life will always have people who are critical of them and people who are supportive of them. That's the nature of public life. All I know is that I have a very important and serious job to do. Looking at extremism, we are working to engage widely, including with critics. We are working on bringing much more evidence to the table about extremism and helping and encouraging people to work with us. That's my agenda. That's what I'm planning to do. And if people have criticisms, by all means, that door is open. Please engage with me. Submit evidence to me. I want to have that dialogue and discussion with you.
Do you think social media platforms are contributing to the normalisation of hate and extremist views?
I am deeply concerned about online extremism that we're seeing. I know this committee, I know the chair in particular has highlighted things like national action videos, which is still not being taken down. Of course, illegal terrorist content has to be taken down. My particular concern is extremist content which is legal. So on the one hand, we have issues like the Darren Osborne case, which, his trial showed, that he had been consuming legal extremist content by groups like Britain First and others, and how that was a motivating factor for him. He'd consumed a significant amount of that content. Now, that content is legal. On the other hand, we've got, as Sir Mark Rowley mentioned on the Today programme on Friday, how if you put into YouTube and Google UK Muslim spokesperson on YouTube, the top 4 searches is Anjem Chowdhury. Again, at what point does that encourage somebody to take that step into extremism because they're being exposed to that material? There are other examples where, I don't know if you recall, Tommy Robinson, after the Westminster Bridge attack, he went to Westminster Bridge, filmed a very inflammatory video, and that video received millions of views in the space of 72 hours. There's been research by the Institute for Strategic Dialogue who undertook a piece of study where they examined 162 public Facebook pages of extreme right-wing groups and found that around 40,000 people were actively engaging with that group, and thousands of whom were putting up extremist and hateful content. The scale is actually mind-boggling, and I'm not sure if the tech companies and the social media companies genuinely do understand the breadth, the scale, but also from our part, understanding that we have a challenge where extremist content is currently legal. How do we address and challenge that issue?
That's an excellent answer, and I appreciate that. But do you think social media platforms have to accept responsibility, and do you think they do? Do you think they do?
They do to some degree. We have seen some change. We've seen how Facebook have employed 3,000 more people, but I think there's a lot more that they can be doing.
And I don't know, did you hear the evidence session prior to yours?
No.
So there was some, from the Assistant Commissioner, some very positive comments about the progress that has been made, but still more to be done. Would you agree with that?
With the tech companies?
With social media companies dealing with this type of images and videos, and particularly because I'm not sure I'm on the same page, and I think the Chair alluded to this as well as the Assistant Commissioner, about the companies working together to tackle this.
I mean, it depends which content and imagery you're talking about. We know, and the Security Minister has highlighted this, that they have improved and got a lot faster in taking down illegal terrorist content. My concern is the extremist legal content, which is the threshold is not high enough for it to be taken down. Are they doing enough to address that, whether it's taking it down or whether it's devising new technology where there's a better response to challenging conspiracy theories or fake news or disinformation campaigns, which are the bread and butter tactics of extremist groups? I don't think they are. Are they doing enough to ensure that we have better conversations on social media? We've had some interaction with them already, and they're saying that this is something that they are wanting to look at. So I support that, but we want to continue to have a productive conversation with them. And I guess one of the reasons why I want to do the study is to try and gather the evidence about scale and harms in particular, to show them, here is the evidence, this is what the evidence is telling us. For you to turn around and say, we're not going to take this seriously, is no longer sufficient, because here is the evidence.
You mentioned conversations there twice, and in one aspect it was about better conversations with the social media companies, and I understand that, but you also said better conversations on social media. What do you mean by that?
So my staff have been having some helpful conversations with them, and how...
No, sorry, I want to focus a bit about better conversations on social media.
So this is something that some of the companies are now looking at. So, for example, Twitter. We see, for example, how you could be on Twitter having a conversation with somebody, and a perfectly legitimate, healthy debate, and then before you know it, a third person has jumped in and has just turned that conversation very, very toxic, where previously two of you have been having quite a healthy debate. My staff have been speaking to staff at Twitter about how do you prevent things like that from happening, to ensure that debate is not toxified. How can we try and ensure we have better conversations online? So I know that they are looking at this. That's something we encourage, that's something we applaud, we want to see that. I mean, this is a much more wider problem than extremism, because I think this is a much more wider societal issue.
Okay,
but that's something we need to see more of.
At the more very individual element of this, in terms of extremism, is it better to remove these images immediately before people see them, or is there a case that actually allowing them to be on social media, for these conversations to exist, for people to see how outrageous they are and how they are deplored by the majority of people, there is an element of usefulness in that?
That's a very difficult and complex question, because if that content is legal, we have to be mindful of freedom of expression, legitimate freedom of expression in our country, and we know that freedom of expression is a cornerstone of our democracy. That includes the right to mock, to ridicule, to offend. So that's a very difficult question. I think you have to look at it on a case-by-case scenario. So I can't answer that question unless there are specific examples. But I think that's a very important point you've raised, and it's something that I'm certainly going to consider.
Thank you, Chair. I won't ask the question of whether you think that a man over the age of 40 who had had run a think tank and had written a book on extremism would have been asked, had their credentials questioned in the same way. But I suspect that most of the panel would guess at the answer. I actually wanted to ask you about what you said in terms of the way, the black and white way in which that counter-extremism, counter-terrorism can be defined. Are you keen that your work gets into what you seem to be suggesting is the artificiality of that division, and whether you believe that division is in itself dangerous?
I've obviously come from outside of government, so when I started the role and I saw that, for example, the government has an integration or a proposed integration strategy, the government has a counter-extremism strategy, the government has a counter-terrorism strategy, I was very clear from the start that I want to look at the issue of extremism with a very wide lens. And for me, the interest that I particularly have is the overlap between integration and extremism, and the overlap between extremism and terrorism, and of course, and the wider extremism space. So, you know, I'm keen to ensure that we do look at that, and to ensure, because I just feel if we don't look at it that way, we aren't really going to understand extremism properly. We have a lack of consensus about extremism in our country because we aren't looking at it through that wide lens, and that's not helping us in developing the robust response to extremism that we need. So I've taken the approach that you need to have a wide lens to look at this issue and to, again, look at those two grey areas of overlap.
I guess kind of related to that, were you given a reason when you took on the role as to why formally Prevent was hived off from it?
I can't remember. I think it's because the Commission came out from the counter-extremism strategy and from the counter-extremism unit.
It was a siloed thing rather than an intent
so.
beyond
but
that.
I'd have to check and I can...
No, that's fine. you talk about the whole societal approach,
Yeah.
and I just wondered what you thought about this place and
About
how
Parliament.
and how Parliament is geared up and the conversations we have. I mean, you say you weren't shocked, you were disappointed. I have to say I was shocked by the reaction from some of the people, prominent people in this place, to your appointment. Do you think there is a problem with the way that counter-extremism is discussed within Parliament?
I mean, I think there's two issues there. There's a wider civility issue,
Yes.
and also, you know, I know we're talking about Parliament, but when I go and speak to people in towns and cities across the country, how people are describing to me increased division and polarisation. I went to one very multicultural city, which I won't name, where they even said where actually different Asian communities used to live together quite peacefully. Now the division between Hindus and Muslims, Muslims and Sikhs and so forth is just at another scale that wasn't there 30 years ago. So I think we are, as a whole, both I think in political discourse but also in our communities, seeing that greater division, that extremism can thrive in that climate, it can also drive that climate. So I think there's a wider question about civility. What's happened to our civility? Where has it gone? How can we reclaim it? I do feel that there is a very hostile climate around counter-extremism. As I mentioned at the beginning, I have been really dismayed and upset to hear the experience of counter-extremists in the sense that the bullying, the abuse, the lack of support, and even people who I know support Prevent. I mean, I know Prevent's not my remit, but when I've spoken to imams, for example, or women's groups who say they support Prevent, but they say to me, but you know, Sarah, I'll never say that publicly, because if I do, I know I'm going to get so much abuse. There's no space to even say, well, actually, as a Muslim, I do support Prevent. I know there are people who don't, but the fact that people feel they can't even express support for a counter-terrorism strategy, or even say, look, you know, I can't openly talk about this, I think that's really disheartening. And I've spoken to, obviously, a number of academics, and again, academics have said to me, yes, I want to share this information with you, but please don't put my name down, because I know if I talk about this, it's going to have a very negative impact on me, and I'm going to experience bullying, backlash and abuse. This is academics. This is a country where we support academic freedom, and academics are telling me that I get abuse, and on the other hand, we're getting death threats from extremists.
You've had Britain's first female Muslim cabinet minister, Conservative, the same colour as the current the same party as the current administration, criticising you for being too close to the government. That's a problem, isn't it?
I've had a very constructive conversation with Baroness Barty. I reached out to her after my appointment. I've had a very helpful conversation with her. Clearly there are lots of things we agree on. There are issues around extremism we disagree on. That's absolutely fine. I think, you know, Baroness Barty had never met me prior to those comments. So, you know, I like I said, I'm very keen to engage and to have those conversations and to try and bring more people together around what is a very important topic.
My final question was just about how much of a challenge you find it, and how you are trying to overcome that challenge in having that conversation within conservative Muslim circles who may still be highly male dominated, and how much of an issue you find that.
It's probably the same when I speak to Orthodox Jewish communities as well. I don't think it's any particularly different with regards to Muslims. It's fruitful. I have to say it's constructive, because when I'm speaking to imams, whether it's in Portsmouth or Liverpool or Manchester or others, when you open up that conversation, I often feel that there's not a safe space for them to talk about it. And when you talk to them, they'll say to you, yes, you know, on the one hand, where our mosques are being targeted by far-right extremists, but on the other hand, you know, we do know we have a problem of religious extremists and hardliners who are trying to radicalise young people. It's been amazing how, having won their trust, they are telling me about religious hardliners and extremists within their own communities, how they fear that they are powerless against the internet in radicalising their young congregation. And then them saying to me, we want help, Sarah. We don't know how to deal with this, and we wish we could have more imams coming together and looking at this issue and supporting each other. So those conversations are very important to me, but I also think it's very important for them to come and say, this is a long-standing problem, and we need support, and we need better ways of addressing it.
Thank you.
Just to pick up the point you raised about people's fear of bullying when it comes to trying to speak out in terms of counter-terror work. Why do you think that is happening? Do you think that is a direct consequence of the difficult debates around counter-terror, or is it happening for some other reason and is then just feeding into the counter-terror work?
It's probably a combination of different things. I mean, these things are never a black and white answer. The fact that the lack of civility is a problem, is an issue. I see how that and the way we talk to each other and the very abusive climate now we all live in does impact that. When I'm speaking to people, they are making quite clear to me that there are those whose interest it is in not countering extremism, how it is extremists themselves who are at the forefront of ensuring that they close down the debate, that they deliberately attack, abuse and create a climate where you don't want to do this work. That's the overriding message I've heard over the last couple of months. So there's on the one hand there's the wider problem, but I think on the other hand there is an organised active lobby of extremists and extremist sympathisers where they know it's not in their interests to have counter-extremism or counter-terrorism work because it's fundamentally in opposition to what they stand for.
But in fairness, there are also lots of people who fully support counter-extremism work but have significant and perfectly reasonable problems and challenges with Prevent as well.
No, I agree with that. You know, I mean, I have concerns about different aspects of counter-extremism and counter-terrorism. That's why I oppose the counter-extremism bill. But they don't necessarily contribute to the climate of abuse and intimidation. And the chilling impact on freedom of expression of certain people. So I agree with what you're saying. But if the question is about the abuse and the direct harassment and the horrendous tactics that I hear about, including death threats, that's coming from a very particular lobby whose interest it is in not countering extremism.
But in terms of, sorry.
Yeah. So I mean, so. And again, it goes back to the point of this is the climate that counter-extremists or those involved in counter-terrorism are operating in. The sad truth is a lot of them are operating on a shoestring. A lot of charities don't really have counter-extremism funding streams. There's very little recognition of the importance of this work. So funding is poor, resources are poor, many of the organisations I've spoken to are pretty small. Yet we have this huge problem of growing extremism, and on the other hand, we have counter-extremists who are struggling with resources, are operating in a hostile climate, and don't feel they're getting the support. And even with organisations that have been around for a significant amount of time, I was quite amazed at, we put a workshop together and brought a number of them around the table, how they felt just sitting together in the same room. Having that conversation was so fruitful because they find it's isolating work. It's not easy, and everyone has got a criticism, and it's very personal and abusive, and that climate really worries me. And I want to look at what more can we be doing to support counter-extremists who are doing such vital work at such a difficult time.
Okay, great.
That's not what you're saying. Forgive me if you can challenge this, but it feels a bit anecdotal. What's the evidence of rising extremism? What's the evidence of this bullying behaviour? Could you give us some really specific examples of where it's coming from and how it manifests itself? And what, in your assessment, are the most effective interventions to tackle it?
So there are a number of different indicators that are telling that there's rising extremism. Firstly, when I've gone around the country and people are sharing with me those experiences are very real. So when local councils and authorities are telling me about the increase in number of far-right marches, for example, or for example how Ofsted will tell me that since 2014 the number of books that they are finding in particular faith schools which are advocating stoning, execution, or promoting homophobia.
Are you able to publish those numbers?
So this is part of the evidence that we want to gather as part of the study to try and build that entire picture. And of course, when I'm speaking to academics, one of the things that we found from the ongoing review into academic literature that they cite there's rising and increasing extremism, but obviously aren't able to indicate to what extent. And then there's this wider polls around. The BBC, for example, did a poll which showed that 73%, I think it was 3/4 of the British public feel that we've become increasingly more divided. Hope Not Hate have done research which has shown there's concerns around that division. But just the types of incidences we're seeing, and particularly with far-right extremism. I mean, I believe we're at the beginning of a new wave of far-right extremism in this country. I speak to, again, experts and practitioners on the ground, and they are deeply concerned about how, where initially we thought the far right were declining, that decline has now gone into reverse, again because of online, but also because of the repackaging and the new breed of far right extremism. We're seeing how they are, how they've become modernised, they've become professionalised, how they are misusing and deliberately adopting the language of human rights as a cover for their extremism. And now the reach that they have, I think this is a significant problem. And of course, we're seeing this across the world in many different countries. I don't think Britain is immune, but I think that we need to understand that we are seeing growing extremism. On the Islamist side, we understand that there is growing activism around Hizb ut-Tahrir in places like Bradford, Birmingham, Stoke-on-Trent, who are targeting young people. They'd slightly dipped over the last couple of years. They are now making a resurgence. So on both the far right and on the Islamist side, there is clear evidence and signs that we are seeing a resurgence.
And are you gathering, or have you gathered evidence of effective strategies to tackle it? So
this is what we are looking at. As part of the evidence, that's very much the fifth theme, the response. What is the government's response? How are others dealing with it? One of the key issues that I want to look at is also the current legal toolbox. What measures do we currently have in place, and are we using them effectively?
And are they working? Is that one of the questions you're asking?
Are they working? And are we using them effectively for the time and the era that we're living in? But there's a whole range of different issues, and we want to speak to counter-extremists, think tanks, academics, for them to tell us, you tell us what's working, whether it's a very local civil society-based example, an approach, which some have shared with us, to much more larger national schemes, to online initiatives. That's something that we're very keen to collect, but also to understand what doesn't work. I think it's very fruitful to also know what doesn't work in countering extremism. If we're going to spend lots of money on it, we need to ensure that we're not spending it on projects that aren't having an impact and aren't working. John Wilcock.
Thank you. It's interesting you mentioned looking at the legal toolbox just in your last answer. And I wanted to ask you, given you are clearly really alive and interested in exploring further the interplay between non-violent extremism leading to violence, and you mentioned Hizb ut-Tahrir, why did you then oppose the idea of a counter-extremism bill, and is your view on that open, or do you remain of the view that that is a bad move?
Hizb ut-Tahrir have clearly stated they don't support violence. They're very much in the non-violent extremism space. So that is quite difficult, although their wider preachings and their views, I think it's quite clear that they are extremist. I want to be very much driven by the evidence. I want my view now is obviously going to be different to my position in 2015, because what I want to do now is to collect all the evidence. I want to understand where the gaps are. I want to understand things like the Darren Osborne case to see if there are legal gaps. At the moment, that's the stage where we're at, where we're collecting the evidence to examine it. So that's probably a good question to again ask me next time once the study has come out. Because at the moment, I just don't know whether is it a problem that we have the legal powers in place, but we're not using them effectively, or is the problem that we actually do have gaps in our legislation? And so that's, again, something
you thought you knew the answer in 2015 when you said that the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister was wrong?
Well, from what I was seeing at that point in terms of freedom of expression concerns, I still hold those freedom. My position hasn't changed on
Sure.
that. I still have those concerns around the disruption orders, the banning orders, and so forth. And I agree with people like Lord Anderson on that. So my view hasn't changed about that particular piece of legislation. That may be very different to what we see in the future.
Okay, thank you.
When do you expect to produce, are there any reports or interim reports or responses based on the work that you're doing?
The study we're hoping to publish in spring of next year, but we are hoping to perhaps publish other things along the way and some of the evidence along that journey.
What would you like to be different by this time next year as a result of your work?
I guess greater confidence in people feeling more confident that they understand extremism better. They feel they have the greater confidence to challenge extremists. That we've moved away from, if, for example, and I've heard a lot of this, is that if someone challenges Islamist extremists, they get labelled an Islamophobe, that we don't have that kind of shutting down the debate type of approach. And that people have bought into the counter-extremism agenda a lot more. One of the reasons why I've been engaging widely is because I do feel sometimes is that there is a small group of people involved in the counter-extremism tent.